Hello world, Julio here. And in today's video, I wanted to take the time to show you guys how you can create a really beautiful landing page. So this landing page is going to have two types of animation. One of them is going to be this hue rotation type of thing using CSS filters, and then the other one is going to be an up and down motion. So even though they're basic, there's still a lot to learn here because this landing page is fully responsive, so it's going to work all across different devices. I know the video is kind of long, but I really did want to take my time to explain things as best as I possibly could. So I hope you guys just don't think that this video is like dragging too long. But if you enjoyed the video and found it useful, please make sure that you give it a thumbs up. Leave a comment down below if you have any questions, and subscribe to the channel if you're new. I know that YouTube sometimes doesn't deliver notifications even when you do turn it on, so be sure to follow me on social media for sure, because I always update everyone who follows me there whenever I have a channel update or just post a new video. All the links are going to be in the description below. Now let's jump right in. So, for those of you that want to follow along with me, I'm going to be placing a link in the description below where you can find the starter files you see here. Keep in mind that they're only going to be starter files, not completed ones. So pause the video and then come back once you've had those files. What I'll do now is just open up my project here in the browser, and then I can have my editor and browser side by side, which is going to allow me to see the changes as they're happening. Then let's begin by setting up the header tag inside of the body. And then I'm going to have a div with the class of container. And I'm going to be using this container div to kind of limit how big or how wide, I should say, the content inside of it is going to stretch. Then I'm going to have the nav tag itself, and I'm going to apply the nav class. In here, I'm going to have an anchor tag with the class of logo box. Then I can just point this back to the index.html. And inside of here, I'm going to have an image. The image is going to have the class of logo. And then we can just simply reference the image that we want by going inside of the images folder that we have and then finding the logo.png. Then in here, I'm also going to have a UL with the class of navlist. Then I'm going to have an li with the class of navitem. And finally, we will have an anchor tag with the class of navlink. And then this is just going to have a placeholder. Also, I do realize that I can just nest all of this using emid a lot quicker, but at the same time, I don't want to confuse anyone, especially if they're watching this video and they don't even know what emid is. So now that we have the basic structure for the navigation, we can just simply copy this and paste it down below. Since we only have 3 items, that's how many times we are going to need it. Now for the first one, we had about. Then the second one, we had case study. And finally, we had FAQ. And this is going to be the basic structure for our header/navigation. Now let's find the closing tag for the header, and underneath we are now going to lay out the HTML markup for the main content. So for this we will need a section tag, and then I'm going to be applying the class of landing page. Now in here, I want to reuse the same container. Again, the same reason, because I want to limit how far the content is going to stretch to. And I also wanted to line up with this content here that we have for the nav. So it's just going to make everything look a lot better. Now, inside of the container, I also want to set up a basic grid. So I will have a div with the class of content, and this is where I'm going to be setting up my grid within CSS later on. So we have to break this down into 2 pieces. So the first one is going to be a div with the class of content details. And in here, we are going to have all the additional content, such as the title, description, social media icons, and also the inputs. So let's take care of that. Let's have an H1 with the class of title. And in here, we can just have the text, time travel to the future. Then underneath, we can have a p tag with the class of paragraph. And in here, what I'll do is just simply copy the text that I already had from the original design and paste it in here. However, if you don't want to do that, you can just use some dummy text, such as lorem ipsum, which you can just generate using emit by typing in lorem and then just hitting tab on your keyboard. But I'm just going to stick with this text. If you want to have the same exact text, then feel free to pause the video just so that you can copy this. Now, I want to group my inputs together. So underneath of the p tag, I'm going to have a div with the class of search. This could also be a form. It doesn't really matter. For this example, I'm just going with a div. Then I'm going to have an input, and this input is going to have the class of search box. Or actually, let me give this the class of search bar instead, because it just makes more sense. Now the input is going to remain as type of text. Then we also want to have a placeholder so that we can have a text value inside of it. Well, not necessarily a text value, but just some text inside of it that lets you know what you have to put in. So this will say your email address. And then I'll make this a required field. For my second input, what I want to do now is have a button. So I'm going to use another input. You could also have the button element itself. It doesn't really matter. But in this demo, I'm just going to be using an input. This input is going to have the class of search btn. And this is really important. Pay attention, because if you just keep it as type of text, it's just going to give us another box. So what we have to do is just have the type of button instead. But it doesn't really have any text inside of it, and there's really nowhere to put it. So how do we take care of that? Well, that's because we have to use the value attribute. And in here, we can just simply say join. And now we have some text inside of the button. Now let's go here underneath of the closing tag for the search div, and I'm going to be laying out the markup for these social media items. So let's have a div with the class of SM list. And this SM, it just stands for social media. I could also have used a UL here with some list items and whatnot, but I didn't really want to deal with that anymore, so I just went really basic, and I'm using a div, which later we will play around with flexbox and stuff just to align things. Then I'm going to have several anchor tags. The first one here is going to have the class of smLink. And then we can just use a placeholder again, but in the real world, this would have the link to that particular social media account. And then in here, I'm going to have an icon from Font Awesome. So we have to apply some Font Awesome classes. The first class is going to be FAB, and then we need an additional class that is going to be FA Twitter. And just like so, you can now see that we have the little Twitter icon. So let me just go down here, and I'm going to copy this, paste it down below 3 times. And the only thing that we have to do here is just modify the Font Awesome classes. So this one is going to be for Instagram. The third one is going to be for Facebook, but we want the Facebook icon that is just the F, so it's going to be FA Facebook F. And the last one is just going to be LinkedIn.
And just like so, we have already finished a good portion of the HTML markup. The only thing left is the other section of this particular grid, which is going to have the images. And then we are also going to have several other images throughout the website that we will use position absolute to just kind of like place all over the place. So now that we have here this content details div, let's find the closing tag for it, which is this one right here. And what we want to do here is just have another div, and this is the div that's going to be the container for the images. So I'll just call it image group. And we are going to have two images here. The first image, well, both of them are going to be essentially the same except for the images themselves. So I'm going to call this one blob. Actually, I'll just call it large instead. This way we can just keep it separated. And we can just point to the images folder and we can find the image with the name of LIQ5, just like so. Then what we can do here is just duplicate it down below, and then we can switch the other image to be number 4. And then this class is going to change to blob bean. And as the name suggests, the only reason why I gave it that class name is because it kind of just reminds me of a bean. So now we here have the basic structure for our grid. What we have to do now is just have all the other images that we are going to have throughout the website. However, we are just going to be placing that outside of the container that we have right here, because I want to position all those images absolute to this section right here, which has the class of landing page. So this image is going to have the class of blob, and then it will have a second class of blob1. I know, not the most creative names, but you kind of get the point. Then we'll go back inside of the images folder, and we are going to find the image with the name of LIQ1. Then for the rest of them, we can actually just use Control D to duplicate it down below. And we are going to need 4 of them. So the classes here we have to modify to 2, 3, and 4. Then the same thing for the images, 2, 3, except that for this one, for the last one that we have right here, this is actually image 6. And now we have all of the images that we need. And with that, the HTML markup is all complete. The next step is going to be going inside of the CSS file so that we can continue. So what I want to do here is just apply a basic reset. So let me actually just set up a comment of base styles, or I'll just say base instead. Then I will use the universal selector, and I'm going to say that the margin will be set to 0, the padding to 0 as well, and then the box sizing to border box. And this is just going to make our life a lot easier, because this means that the padding and borders and things like that are going to be calculated into the total width and height of the element, as opposed to calculating it outside of it, which can just be a nightmare sometimes when you want to size elements. Then I want to select the HTML document, and then here I want to apply a font size of 62.5%. And this basically just translates to 10 pixels. The reason why I'm using percentages is because it just makes your website scale a lot better when you use something like Zoom. And also because I prefer using rem units, and rem units are relative to the HTML document, and it's just going to make the math a lot easier. You'll see how that plays out later on. Now I want to apply some default styles to the body as well. This is going to be the font size that I will set to 1.6 rem. So this is what I mean by making the math a lot easier. So if we just leave it at 16, which is the default, when we use the rems, this is just going to be something like 20 something pixels. But since we made it 10, we can just simply say 1.6 rems, and that's going to equal 16 pixels. And that's how it makes the math a lot easier. Then for the font family, I'm going to be using Montserrat. And something to keep in mind is that I already have this font installed in my computer, which is why I can just use it like so. If you don't have it, make sure that you download it from Google, unless you want to use some other font. Then I want to select all of my anchor tags, and I will set the text decoration to none. And that's just going to get rid of the annoying underline. Then I also want to select all of my images, and I'm going to give this a max width of 100%. The reason being because in certain situations, your images can just overflow their parent container, so the max width at 100% is just going to make sure that that doesn't happen. So now that we have the base right out of the way, what we can do is just play around with the header. So let's select the header. I'm going to give this a position of absolute because I want it to float on top of the section, because I'm going to be using a nice transparent background. And then I'm going to give this a top position of 0 and a left of 0 as well. And this is just going to make sure that this is always like the starting point. I'm also going to give this a C index. And the C index is going to be a high value just because I want to make sure that this header always stays on top of the content that we have here. Something else that I want to do here is give this a width of 100%. Because since we have it floating, it's now only going to take up as much space as it needs. So this width of 100% is going to come in handy later on when we use Flexbox on the nav. And I do apologize if the audio isn't so good because I have a stuffy nose. Now we can go ahead and target the nav itself. And I know it doesn't look all that great because of how it is over here, but I promise you that it's going to look a lot better later on. First, I'm going to set up a height of 10 rem, so that's roughly 100 pixels. And we also don't need to specify a width because by default a nav is a block level element, which means that it already takes 100% of the available width. So now we can just do a display of flex to get them to be side by side, and just so that we can kind of see things better, what I'm going to do is select my section. For the time being, we are going to be changing this later on. It's just a little bit distracting right now. So I will say that for the moment, display is going to be of none. So now the only thing visible is going to be the header and navigation. So now with the distraction out of the way, I also want to align my items here all the way at the bottom, just so that we have a nice space up top. So to do that, it's pretty simple. We just simply have to say align items, flex, end. And now they have moved to the bottom. So if we go back here and we check, you can confirm. What I want to do now is just have space between them. So we can do justify content space between. Just like so. Before we move any further, I also want to take care of this container that we have. So remember that I said that I wanted to limit how big it's going to stretch to. So since I'm going to be reusing this, I will actually just have a whole section for utility classes. So utilities, and then here I can just have container. And let's also have a comment here for the header as well. And what I want to do here for the container is just limit how wide it's going to stretch to, as I mentioned. So I'm going to have a max width of, let's say, 125 rem. I also want to make sure that I place my container in the middle because, as you can see, it's all the way to the left. So I'm going to have a margin, top and bottom of 0, and auto left and right. And now it's going to be perfectly in the middle here. And as you can see now, it's smaller, so it's taking 100% of the available width. So what I want to do is just create extra spacing around it. So I'm also going to give this padding left and right. And I'm going to do 1.5 rem. And that's going to be all for now that I'm going to be doing to the container. I don't really need anything else. So we can just go back to styling the nav. So here we can select the nav list. And then we can just also give this a display of flex. I also want to get rid of the bullet points. So to do that, we just do a list style of none. Then I want to select the nav item. And what I want to do here is just create some separation between them. So I'm going to give it a margin right. And I will do 5 rem. But now we have extra space here at the end of the FAQ, which is something that we don't really want. So let's select the nav item once more, and then the last child. And we'll say that the margin right is going to be 0, so now it's back to how we want it. The next step is going to be styling the links. So we'll just select the nav link. And here we will say that the font size is going to be 1.2 rem. Then we want to make it uppercase, so we'll do text transform of uppercase. I also want to apply a color here, and it's going to be a color of white. For the time being, it's just going to disappear because it's blending in with the background. So since we haven't done the background color on the section yet, we'll just comment this out until we actually finish styling it. I also want to apply a hover effect to the link. So let's select the link once more, and then its hover state. Here, I'm going to do something really basic, so I'm just going to play around with the opacity. And I'll say 1.6. And that looks good. So we can make it even better by adding a transition here on the nav link. So transition, and then opacity over something like 0.3 seconds. And that looks a lot better than before. So the next thing that I want to do now is make this logo slightly smaller because it's just too big. And the image itself, it doesn't look all that great when it's that big either. So I'm going to select the image itself, which I gave the class of logo. Something that I want to do here is just give this a display of block because usually by default, the images are going to have some styles to them. So just pay attention to what happens when I make it a display of block. You see it now moved down. So let me just show you that again. It moves up when I remove it, and then it moves down once I add it back in. Like I said, I want to make it smaller, so I'm going to give it a width of 8 rem, I should say. And now I'm pretty satisfied with how the navigation looks. So now that we have taken care of the navigation, we can now basically remove the styles that hid the content on the section that we had. And we'll just select the section itself, which has the class of landing page. Let's also add a comment here. And then what I want to do here is give this a width of 100%. I want to give this a min height of 100 of the BH. And the reason for that is because later on, if we have a lot more content than we account for in mobile devices, we'll just have the ability to scroll down. So the next step is going to actually be applying a background image. So this background image is going to be a linear gradient. So the direction is going to be to bottom right. And then it's going to have the following hex values. And then for the second color, we are going to have 2B and then 3153. Now that we have a background here, you see that the links are not going to be able to blend in all that great. So let's go back and uncomment this out, because originally we want this to be color of white. I also want to give this the position of relative. The reason for that is because I'm going to be placing a pseudo element absolute to this landing page. And this pseudo element is just going to have that pattern image that we have in the original demo. And I also want to hide my overflow because we have quite a bit of it. So overflow hidden. And one last thing that I want to do here is align this container that we have here inside of this landing page section. So this container and all the content inside of it. And for that, we can just use flexbox, display a flex. And then what we can do here is align items to the center. Remember that we still have a bunch of other images there, so it kind of just like messes it up a little bit, but don't worry, this is going to look a lot better as we keep styling this website. So as I mentioned, we are going to be using the before pseudo element. So landing page, before, we'll set up the content, then the position is going to be of absolute, starting top 0, left of 0, and then here we can just have the width to be inherited. So it's going to have the 100% that this landing page has. And then for the height, we can actually just do a regular height of 100 of the BH. Then we are going to have the pattern itself. So for that, we can do another background image. And this one, we can just say URL, go inside of our images folder, and find the BG pad, which is BG pattern. And just like so, we can now see the image, but it's repeating. So as opposed to doing just no repeat, we can just do a background size of cover. And now it's going to take up all the available space, just like so. But as you can see, it kind of looks a little bit too strong. So I'm going to play around with the opacity value. And I'm going to say something like 0.4. And as you can see, it looks a lot better than it did before. We also have another issue. As you can see, it's on top of all the other images that we have. So to fix that, we can just use a C index of -1. Well, not totally fix it, because as you can see now, it completely disappeared. And that's because it's right behind its parent, which means that we have to come back to this landing page and apply C index of 1. And this is just going to make it so that the child that we have right here never falls behind its parent. So now I'm going to style the main content itself. So let's select the content. And as I mentioned before, this is just going to be a really basic grid. So we'll say display of grid. Then we can do something like grid template columns, 1fr, 1fr. And this is just going to distribute both the space between both elements that we have right here, or two sections, I should say, between the text and then the image itself evenly. But we also have some other issues here because the grid is all it's messing up the other images that we have. So what can we do here? Well, not necessarily the grid. This is actually more of a flexbox thing, as you can see. So what can we do here to kind of fix this? Well, for the time being, we can't really do anything about it. But it's kind of messing up the content here as we are not able to see it all that great. So for this particular demo, before we move on, let me just go back inside of the HTML document and comment this out until we are actually ready to style it. So now that we have things how we want it, the next step is going to be actually aligning my items here to the center. And just like Flexbox, we can use align items center. And now the text here and other content is going to align perfectly with this image that we have here. The next thing that I want to do is play around with the inner content details. So content details. And here I'm just going to say max width is going to be 80% because I don't want it to be too close to the images themselves. Now I'm going to select the title, and the title is going to have a font size of 6 rem. The color is going to be white as well. And then I want to create some separation by giving this a margin bottom of 1 rem. What I'll select now is the description. So description, and did I mess this up somewhere? Oh, I actually gave the p tag the class of paragraph. This should have been description actually. So now, after we sort that out, if you have it as paragraph, you can keep it as that. It doesn't really matter. So as opposed to doing description here, you can just do the paragraph selector. I'm going to change the font size here as well. And actually, I think I'm just going to give it as the default that the body has. So scratch that. What I'll do instead is just apply a color. And it's going to be the following hex, which is 929 FC 5. Then I'm also going to apply a little bit of margin bottom to create some additional separation. So the next step is going to be tackling the inputs themselves. And that's not going to be too difficult either. So what I'll do here is just select the search container that you're in, and then the inputs inside of the search container, because I want to apply certain styles that apply to both of them. So this way we don't have to repeat ourselves over and over. So one of those styles that they have in common that I want to take care of is the border. So border is set to none. I also want to give this a border radius just so that we can have rounded corners. And then I'm going to give this some padding all around just to make them larger. Finally, they also have an outline, which is terrible. So I'm going to say outline of none. Now we can select them both individually. So for this example, let me just show you how I got this button to be overlapping this input right here. So let's just say that I'm going to select the search bar. the search bar is going to have a width of 100%. And then I'm going to select the search btn. I'm going to give this a width of 10 rem. And then for the background color, it's just going to be a linear gradient. So we'll use the background image. Direction is going to be to right. And then the color is going to be FF83D5. Then the other color is going to be FFCCB0. Then I'm going to give this a color of white just so that it has a better contrast, and make the cursor of pointer. So how do I actually get this to be on the same line? Well, we have to do a little bit of math here. So we are going to be using the calc function. And I played around with these values just to see what would work. And for me, what I found that worked was the width of 100% minus 0.5 rem. But that doesn't actually fix the issue yet. That's because we also have to apply a negative margin left on the button. So we'll say margin left and then negative 10 rem, which is the exact same width of the button itself. And just like so, they are now both overlapping. The next thing that I want to do here is give this button a hover effect. So btn here, and then let's also not forget the hover. And then we can just copy this background image. And the only thing that we have to do here is just change right to left. So now when we hover, the colors are going to be inverted. Now that the input is styled, we have to style the social media icons. So let's say that the SM list is going to have a display of flex. Then I'm going to also give it a margin top. Or actually, I'm going to just create that separation within this search selector here. And what I want to do here is something like a margin bottom of 2.5 rem. And that's just going to push the content for the social media icons a lot further down. So I could have done a margin top here, but since I've been doing margin bottoms everywhere here, I thought I would just be more consistent with that. So what I want to do next is select the SM links. And I'm going to change the color here as well to the same 929. I'm also going to give this a width of 3 rem, a height of 3 rem, and the reason for that is because I'm going to be using flexbox here, so I need a width and height so that I can perfectly align this icon that I have inside of it in the middle of the circle that I'm going to be drawing using a border. Just like so. So now that you see that we have the box, we can just use a border radius of 50% just to make it perfectly round. Now we can do a display of flex. And so you can see nothing is happening, but if we, for example, just tried align items and then justify content center, you see that the icons are now going to be perfectly aligned. However, we can do this a lot faster with only one line. So let's delete this and go underneath and do SM link and then select the icon inside of it, and then we can just do a margin of auto and it's going to do the exact same thing. I also want to create a little bit of separation here. So let's do a margin right of 2.5 rem. just like so. I also want to have a hover state here, so let's do sm link on hover. I want to have another linear gradient, so background image direction is going to be to right, and then the following hex of A9, 7, 1, and then FF. Second color is going to be 0, 0, F0, FF. So now when we go ahead and hover, you see that we get the linear gradient. However, the contrast between the background and the icon is not all that great, so let's also switch the color of the icon here to white, just like so. So now that we have done this particular section, it's time to style this one that we have here with the images. And for that, let's select the image group. The image group is going to have a text align of center. And just going to center our images here since they are technically block elements inside of it. Well, not block elements, but the image group is a block element. Then what I'll do is give this a position of relative. The reason for that is because I want to position this image in particular anywhere inside of this image group that we have here. So that's exactly what I'm going to be doing now. So the block bean is going to have the position of absolute. The top position is going to be 2.5 rem. And then the left is going to be -1 rem. And those are just the values that I found worked best for me. So if we make this bigger, you'll see that it's going to be right where I want it. I also want to give this a C index just because certain situations you might want to have this be on top of all the other content and not fall behind something else that you might have within your site. So that's why I'm doing something a little higher, such as a C index of 10. Now it's time to go back and actually style all of our images that we have right here. So let's go back inside of the HTML document and just uncomment this out. And it's going to break the layout, but it doesn't matter. That's going to change soon. So let's select every single image that has the class of blob. And here we are going to have the position of absolute. And that's because they all have that particular positioning in common. So I'm going to be using this particular class just to apply all the styles that they have in common. So I also want this to be further behind all of our other content. So I'm going to set a C index of -1 here as well. Now I'm going to select each image individually. So for the blob 1, I'm going to say that the top is going to be -11 rem. And then the left is going to be 50% because I want it in the middle. And then we have to make sure that we transform translate x -50% just to align it perfectly over here. The next one is going to be the blob number 2. And this one is going to be 15 rem from the top. Then -2 rem from the left. And then what I want to do, actually, -2 rem doesn't actually work all that well because it's still too far out. So let me just try something like another 15, maybe 18, or 17. 17 looks good, so we are going to stick with that. Now let's select the blob number 3. And this one is going to be 5 rem from the right. And then negative 24 rem from the bottom. Finally, we have the biggest one over here. So this one has the class of blob4. We can position this one negative 21 rem from the left, and then negative 17 rem from the bottom. And now that we have them exactly where we want them, it's time to play around with the animation values. So for that, we are going to be using keyframes. Let me have another comment here. And the first animation that I will have is going to be for the moving up animation that I have on here. So let's say at keyframes, move up, and then I'll say that the starting point from is going to be transform translate y of 0. And then 2, which is the ending point, transform translate y of 2 rem. And this is exactly, from and to is exactly the same as saying that this is 0% and this is 100%. So now that we have that, let's add it to this image right here, which is the blob large. So let's select that. And then we'll say that the animation is going to be move up. And let's do something like 2 seconds. And then it's going to be an infinite animation. And as you can see, it's already working. However, it's not fluid. And that's because it just starts, it gets to the end, and then it just goes back to the starting point. So to fix that, we have to say that it's going to alternate. And now it's going to go up slowly and then slowly back down again, and it's just going to keep happening over and over again. So now we have to create the moving down animation for the beam. So that's going to be pretty similar as well. So let me just copy this, paste it down below, and then just change the name to move down. And the only difference here is that the 2 is going to be negative. So one is going to be moving up and the other one is going to be moving down at the same time. So it's going to be creating a nicer effect as opposed to having them move at the same speed and direction at the same time. So we can just come down here and apply this animation here at the bottom. So move down. And just like so, you see that one moves down, the other one moves up, and then it looks a lot better than it would if they were just like moving at the same direction at the same time. So the next animation that I want to add is going to be the changing the colors. So for that, we are going to be using the filter, and then we are going to be manipulating the hue rotation. So again, just paste this down below. We can call this one hue shift. Then for the value here, we can have a filter, and then hue rotate. And then here we can do 0 for the starting point. And then here we can just have a rotation of 360 degrees. So now let's go back and apply this hue shift to every single element that we have right here that we want to animate. However, it wouldn't really be a good idea to just like keep repeating ourselves over and over when it comes to applying the same animation to every single element that we want it on. So for that, we are going to actually have another utility class. and I have it all the way up top. This one is, I'm going to call this class hue shift as well. And then what I'll do here is just switch name. And I'm going to make this longer. I'm going to make it 5 seconds instead. So we are going to be going inside of the HTML document now and applying this particular class wherever we need it. So we are going to be applying it to every single image that we have right here. We'll say hue shift. And now, as you can see, they're all changing. We are not going to be applying it to the image group because it's just not gonna be working all that well if we do it on individual images. So if we do it on this div itself, we can still keep the image and the hue rotation effect, because if we just have it, for example, on the image itself, it's not gonna work, and that's because we already have an animation inside of it that is moving it up and down, so they're just gonna clash. So like I said, we can just go ahead and apply it here. Then we can also apply this to the button. So we find the class, we say hue shift, and finally we are also going to have this on the logo. So logo box, hue shift. And as you can see, all of our animations are already looking pretty good. So the only thing left now is to make this responsive. Let's go back inside of the CSS file, and then we are going to start with the media queries. So my first breakpoint is going to be at 760 pixels. And then here I'll just say add media, screen, and max width 768. And this is just going to be for tablets and under. And what I want to do here is just text align, well, not text align, but align my items on the nav to the center, because I'm going to be making this slightly smaller later on. So nav, align items to the center, because I just don't want like all that extra space on smaller screens. Then I'll say that the content grid template columns, I want to make this one fraction. So now they're all going to be here in a column. It's as opposed to a row before. So we also have some issues here with this barely almost touching the social media icons. So what I want to do is just take this image and move it up. So to do that, I'm going to select the content details. And to do that, I'm going to use the order, which is something that we can also use with Flexbox. And I'm going to set it to 1. And by default, the order is set to 0, which is why that if we go ahead and set this content details to 1, even though it's first, it's actually going to place it second, because this one has the order of 0, which means it's going to come first. I also want to give this the max width of 100% now, because since it's in its own line, it's not going to matter as much. And it's also going to look a lot better. Then I want to style the title. And I'm going to make the font size smaller, so I'll do 3.5 rem. Color. And then here, I'm just going to set it to white. Or actually, I don't really need to set a color because I already set the color before, which was white, so we don't really need to do it again. Then, what I want to do next is select the description. And the font size here is going to be 1.4 rem. The next thing that I want to do now is select the image group. So let me just give you an example of this. If we took a look at something like an iPad, for example, right here, I want to make sure that I push this down even further. So if I went back here and said that the image group is going to have a margin top of 10 rem, it's just going to make sure that it's like further down more. Then what I want to do is move some of these images around and get rid of some of them altogether. But before we do that, let me actually resize this and slightly just like move it over. So I'm going to select the blob large, and I'll set the width to be 100%, 70% I should say, and that's going to make it smaller. Now I also want to make this bean smaller and then move it over so that it was how it was before. So the width here is going to be 30%. Then the top is going to be -1 rem. And then the left is going to be something like 5 rem. Just like so. What I want to do next is select the blob 1. And that's going to be this one right here. And then I'll set the display to be none. Then for the blob 2, I'm going to take this one out of here and move it somewhere around here on the bottom. So I'm going to set the left to be of 30 rem. And then for the bottom, we can do something like, let's do -1 rem. We also have an issue that it's not moving, and that's because we have set the top position earlier on. So let's make sure that we also set it back to the original point. So let's just do revert. And now it's going to move exactly where we want it. I'm also going to make it a little smaller. So the width is going to be 25%. Now for the blob number 3, the right is going to be -3 rem. And then the bottom is going to be -25 rem. And now I want to also get rid of this blob over here, because if I look here at the tablets once more, it's just like right underneath of the content, and it doesn't look great. And at the same time, I don't want to actually also have to make it smaller because it's not going to look all that great either. So I'm going to take the blob number 4 and just get rid of it altogether by saying display none. Can't type. And that's going to be all for the tablet size media queries. I also want to target now smaller devices as well. So something smaller than a tablet. So for example, if we looked at something like an iPhone 5, which is a really small screen, it looks alright, but we can still make this a lot better. So let me just grab here the starting point for the media query. And I'll go underneath. And here I can just say something like target anything under 700 pixels. So the nav now is going to fall underneath of the logo. So I'm going to make the nav something like a flex direction of column. And I'm going to make the height smaller because, as you can see, we have a lot of space. So I'm just going to make it half of what we had originally to 5, just like so.
Since this is a really basic navigation with 3 items, we don't really have to go crazy with a hamburger menu, so I decided to just make it like this. Then I'm going to target the logo box. And I'm just going to add a little bit of separation top and bottom. So margin top and bottom is going to be 2 rem, and then 0 left and right. Then for the nav item, I want to reduce the margin right that we had. So margin right, I'll set it to 2.5 rem instead. And there should be no 0 there. Then I also want to select the blob number 2 now. For the time being, we can't really see it all that well because it's somewhere around here. But I'm just going to say display none to get rid of it altogether. Then I want to select the blob number 3, which is this one we have right here. And then I'm just going to reduce the size to 50%. And now it's going to disappear because it's all the way down here out of view. But we can fix that by just setting the bottom and saying that it's going to be 10 rem instead. Just like so. Let me just get rid of the extra space here. And now if we open this up in the browser completely, we look at the responsive view. As you can see, it is fully responsive. You could play around with this, make it even better if you wanted to. But at the same time, I'm already pretty happy with the results, so I'm just going to leave it at that. I hope you guys found this video useful, and if you learned something new, please make sure you give this a like, and also subscribe if you already haven't. I'm going to catch you guys in the next video.